From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 39. Time was once again Frank's enemy, and subtlety would be its first casualty. Certainly a careful and stealthy exfiltration of the storehouse and palace kitchens would have been optimal, but Fraenk had no moments to spare. He would have to go all out and hope he could get to Gingerglade and Fernbrook before they could act. Sprinting past a surprised kitchen staff, Fraenk took the stairs 3 at a time to get back to the grand ballroom. He could hear a distant, thunderous round of applause, then a man speaking. The voice was that of High Lord Whiteleaf. He seemed to be making some address to the crowd. The ballroom itself was empty, but for a few guards standing near the outer doors. The hallway that led deeper into the palace, which was previously blocked by guards, now stood open and was where the sound of the speech was coming from. Fraenk moved towards the voice as quickly as he could, without looking too suspicious. Just another late arrival to his High Lord's speech. He had no time to admire the beautiful construction and artwork in this new section of the summer palace. Everyone seemed to be gathered ahead in the hall, even bigger than the ballroom. This one had 11 thrones set up, where the Lord Elves of the High Council now sat. Whiteleaf stood in front of the centremost and largest throne, where he was now addressing the gathered crowd. His words became clear as Fraenk slipped into the room.
Have benefited from not only my education from the finest minds in all of Samati and the world beyond, but I have been under the care of the wisest and most prudent gathering of elven minds anywhere in the world.
Whiteleaf gestured to the seated elves on either side of him. As another wave of applause rose, the elven lords nodded back dutifully and otherwise looked stately and serene.
I have long sought their guidance for all matters of governance, for the city and beyond. I bestow upon them my highest honour for good and faithful service.
10 servants who had been positioned at the front of the crowd now stepped forward. Each held out something in front of them, which they now passed to the members of the High Council elves. When the servants stepped aside, Fraenk could see that they were small, delicate silver leaves encased in a dome of glass. Fraenk had never seen anything like them, but whatever they were, the crowd exhaled an awed gasp.
I present the leaves of the Borrelian silver tree, the oldest mortal living being in the known world,
High Lord Whiteleaf said.
May your goodness, loyalty and nobility continue long after the last leaf has fallen and blown to the horizon.
Another huge round of clapping and cheers went up. Those are worth a fortune, Fraenk heard a thoroughly drunk elf beside him remark. As High Lord Whiteleaf's speech continued extolling the virtues and achievements of the High Council, Fraenk moved through the back of the crowd forward towards the dais. He could see Farathiel Gingerglade right up front across from the throne, where Lord Fernbrook sat looking smug and devious. Fraenk couldn't tell if he had the necklace in hand, but he certainly sat with the confidence of one whose plan was in order. And if he was in possession of it, then Fraenk wasn't quite sure what to do next. Stop him if he tried to use it. He had to get closer to do that. So Fraenk continued to weave his way through the crowd. A nervous, excited energy seemed to be in the air as Fraenk caught snippets of conversation from the elves he was moving past. What is he doing? He's declaring his ascension. No, he's already High Lord. Promoting someone new to the High Council? I heard he's formed a new alliance with the tyrant. My lady's maid said he's getting betrothed. Fraenk was actually a bit surprised by all this wild speculation. The elves were notoriously tight-lipped about each other and almost never speculated in front of humans about their High Lord. This kind of reckless rumour-mongering was reserved for behind closed doors and after they were well into their cups. But then he realised that was the exact conditions he was in now, only they didn't expect Fraenk to be in amongst them. Fraenk quietly slipped in directly behind Gingerglade just as High Lord Whiteleaf appeared to be finishing up his speech. A kind of breathless hush fell over the gathered elves, and Fraenk realised he'd been too focused on Fernbrook. He missed what the High Lord had said. Whatever it had been, all the High Council looked shocked. A cacophony of mutterings and whispers went up from all gathered. Crispin Whiteleaf began to shout to be heard over the voices.
"You have heard me right, my lords and ladies. From this day forth, I am officially disbanding the High Council of Arathes so that the kingdom may grow, and I along with it. I do not make this decision lightly, and this is not a punishment nor rebuke for those who have served me well. The province, city, and I will be forever grateful for their service."
Now it was Fraenk's turn to be shocked. This was the last outcome he expected from this event. Fraenk stole a glance at Lord Fernbrook, who was red-faced and looked completely blindsided and enraged. Obviously, this wasn't part of his plan either. Good, Fraenk thought. Take away the elves' power, and it wouldn't matter what he did with that necklace. Perhaps for all the skullduggery and murder, Lord Fernbrook's plan would unravel without Fraenk even having to lift a finger. Life never seemed to be short on irony. But when Fraenk looked at Lady Blackroot, expecting to see her with some kind of reaction, she was staring straight ahead impassively like nothing had even happened. Then Fraenk noticed all the High Council was doing the same thing. All except Lord Fernbrook, who had a look of grave concentration on his face.
"I would like to take this time to announce that
High Lord Whiteleaf suddenly faltered, like he'd forgotten what he was about to say. His eyes seemed to go dull and voice lost all of its inflection.
"That I will be abdicating my position as High Lord of Arathes and Warden of the Pale."
"No, my lord," one of the white-clad servants exclaimed, so shocked and despondent that he abandoned all official decorum. The gathered audience was too stunned to notice, but Lord Whiteleaf was not done with his surprises yet.
"And I will be naming as my successor Lord Malgrave Fernbrook."
Whatever personal cost he would bear for it, Fraenk couldn't let this farce continue. Fernbrook was somehow using the necklace to dominate the mind of Crispin Whiteleaf. All the Lord Elves stared off distantly as if they had not heard or didn't care. And given how viciously and contentious some of their meetings were over some of the most trivial matters, they would have been on their feet, battling such a sweeping proclamation rather than looking completely uninterested. It was when the other elven lords of the High Council began to clap their hands mechanically for Lord Fernbrook, without raising any protest or objection. Fraenk knew their minds were also under his control. Lord Fernbrook did his best to look both surprised and reluctantly delighted. He waved out at the crowd who, slowly and hesitantly, began to clap for him. The applause built to some kind of lukewarm enthusiasm. Whether the crowd was too stunned or just not pleased by the notion of a High Lord Fernbrook, it was difficult to say exactly. But there was one person who didn't clap at all. He knew this had been Fernbrook's plan all along. It was how he could take over the entire city without anyone knowing or being able to prevent him. Everyone here, all the most powerful and influential of the elven aristocracy, were all present to bear witness. The High Lord chose his successor and the High Council raised no objection. In a few moments, Fernbrook would accept his lofty new position as High Lord of Arathes and Gwyndair region. Any hope of getting him back off the throne would be nearly impossible. Fraenk had to stop this. Somehow. From his own experience using the necklace, it required focused attention and concentration. If he could distract or interrupt Lord Fernbrook, perhaps the effect could be broken long enough for Lord Whiteleaf and the others of the High Council to return to their senses. It was his only option. Without a second thought, Fraenk shoved past Farathiel Gingerglade and ploughed right into Lord Fernbrook, just as the stately elf stood to accept the honour. The two of them fell back onto the throne he had been just sitting on, tilting it backwards and spilling both of them to the ground. Fraenk knew he only had moments before the elf would recover and activate the necklace's power again. He had to find where Fernbrook was holding the mind thief on his body and lift it from him like an experienced pickpocket.
"Get off me, fool!"
Lord Fernbrook roared, indignant.
"Guards, get him off me!"
"Sorry, sir," Fraenk slurred. "1,000 pardons, my lord." Fraenk quickly pat-searched Fernbrook's hands, neck and pockets, making it look like a fumbling attempt to rise and get off of him. But there was a problem. He couldn't find the necklace anywhere. How was Fernbrook using it if... He felt several sets of powerful hands suddenly wrench him to his feet. Brawny palace guards twisted his arms until they were bound painfully up behind his back. Fraenk looked up, and the entire room was now staring at him. The crowd looked the same way one might if a stray dog had hopped up onto their banquet table and unloaded its bowels in the midst of all the food. For most there, Fraenk could see whatever seething animosity or dislike of humans had been completely reinforced. This might be the last time any human was ever allowed inside the summer palace. His failure was so comprehensive at this point, he would most likely have to board a ship for the farthest point he could reach, if he was allowed to leave at all. There was a very good chance he would be thrown back into the black cell with Carrax the Cutthroat in actuality this time. Yet, for all that transpired, and every effort he had made, Fraenk felt the worst about failing Lady Blackroot. She had trusted him to save her and the district. Now it was very likely that they would become the new High Lord's next victims. Fraenk scanned down the row of elven lords, hoping to communicate his contrition to her, with his eyes, if nothing else. He saw all the lords of the former High Council looking at him, but the way one might stare at a rather uninteresting plain bowl of cold porridge, or perhaps an empty patch of dirt. Even the High Lord Whiteleaf was watching the scene with listless impassivity. In fact, Lord Fernbrook seemed to be the only one on the dais having a strong reaction to Frank's collision. Understandably so. But the way he cursed and blustered, raging at this drunken human idiot, and the utter indignity he suffered because of him, Fraenk realized that there was no way he could be using the necklace's power at the same time. That meant someone else was, and Fraenk cursed himself this time for being the idiot. The answer was there, staring him in the face, literally. Farathiel Gingerglade had a thin sheen of sweat on his brow and a look of grave focus on his face. Fraenk was the only one who noticed a growing bristle of delicate frost forming on the outside of the elf's pocket. The Archpreceptor of Fernbrook was somehow using the Mind Thief's power to control most of the elves on stage. The strain on him must have been enormous because he could only stand and stare straight ahead. Fraenk needed some way to break Gingerglade's concentration, but he was too far away and the guards holding him were too strong. "Fart! Hey, Fart!" Fraenk shouted. Gingerglade made no reaction.
Silence him!
Lord Fernbrook shouted to the guards. "I know your plan, and you're not going to get away with it." Fraenk snapped back at Fernbrook. The old elf gave him a devious smile.
Get him out of here. I don't want a human present when I accept my new duty as High Lord of Arathis. In fact, they're going to find the city much less to their liking in the days to come.
Fraenk felt a firm hand on his shoulder and saw that it was arch-partisan Olwyn Brightrock. "Olwyn! Stop that preceptor Gingerglade right there!" Fraenk pleaded. For a moment he had a sickening feeling of dread that Farathiel had Arch Brightrock in his thrall as well, for the look he gave was calm and without as much of the loathing glare that Fraenk had become so accustomed to.
"Scark that, Neversleep. You're in enough trouble already."
Brightrock growled, digging his fingers painfully into Frank's shoulder. "Thank the powers you're all right." Fraenk winced. "Please, you have to listen."
"Let's go,"
Brightrock said to the guards, and they began to frog march Fraenk out of the room. "No, wait!" Fraenk cried as he was forced away. He had one last opportunity to do something before it would all be over. "Fart! How'd you like the strip search?" Fraenk shouted over at Gingerglade. He saw the elf's brow furrow for just a moment, but it was the reaction he was looking for. "Did you like that?" "It was my idea," Fraenk continued. Gingerglade's face twisted in anger. Then something else interesting happened. Lady Blackroot and Lord Colour Mosswater suddenly shook their heads and began to blink. They looked like someone had just woken them up, or pulled them out of a trance. It was working. "What about when I ordered my horse to bite you, Fart?" Fraenk chided. "You cried like a whelp. 'Ooh, me arm! He broke me arm!' I'll be laughing about that nibble as long as I live." Gingerglade twitched again, seeming to recoil from the memory of Jimothy, savaging his arm. This time, Lady Ilsa Coldfrost blinked back to her senses and looked about like she was unsure of how she'd even gotten here. Fraenk had one final gambit. He hoped it would be enough. "And the Lindblood girl you tried to strangle, I saved her and she told me your entire plan to take over the city," Fraenk announced. The crowd of elves were all watching him now, keenly interested. Even arch-partisan Brightrock paused his guards so Fraenk could continue.
Get him out of here!
Lord Fernbrook shouted from the stage. "Let's hear what the man has to say!" Lord Callan Hardoak cut in. He was now free of the necklace's effect as well. "You hired them to steal the Yneas Tylerborn, the wizard's magic pendant that can bend one's mind. When it came time to pay, you tried to stiff them, but you didn't know they had an inside man, or rather an inside kobold. They stole it back, so you sent that psychopathic Bass Greenbrier to hunt it down, and he slashed his way across the city trying to get it back. You set her up at the lighthouse, then used your connections at the Hornet's Hive to slip in and try to silence her." Farathiel Gingerglade screeched in rage, surprising everyone around him.
"You think you're clever, huh, Neversleep?"
Gingerglade's smile twisted into a look of pure venomous spite. Then his eyes rolled back and he cupped his hands together in front of himself. A glaze of sparkling ice suddenly encased them. Fraenk looked around nervously. Gingerglade was using the necklace on someone, but who? His answer came a moment later, the whooshing sound of a blade followed by a heavy whack that sent a hot spray of liquid across his face. The guard standing to Frank's left released his pinned arm, and his head pitched forward way further than normal anatomy would allow. Then his entire body went boneless, in a gurgling splash of blood. The fallen guard revealed another figure standing just on the other side, holding a blood-covered silver sword and grinning like a maniac.
"I challenge you to a duel, Neversleep,"
High Lord Crispin Whiteleaf screeched. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.